Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2, where we're going to take a bit of a dive into the new Battle Pack. The working title for this in development was Aftermath. That's why all the new content is prefixed AM, in case anybody was wondering about that. Of course, I know because this Battle Pack was my project. The overall concept was to focus on smaller scale content, battles and even mini campaigns that players could feasibly play through in an evening or an afternoon. There are absolutely people who subscribe to a bigger is better kind of mindset when it comes to scenarios, and obviously chunky battalion-sized engagements have their place and appeal, but I felt like the sub-company scale was a bit underrepresented. The result is 4 short campaigns and 7 standalone scenarios. Mikey D made the Neighborhood Vendetta scenario and did all the graphics, which I'm super grateful. Scenarios just don't look right unless they have the proper graphics. I made everything else. The 2 basic American campaigns, Hornet's Nest and Bitter Enders, are both pretty straightforward and conventional. Hornet's Nest is a platoon level Black Hawk Down adjacent experience. Bitter Enders is a bit more combined arms with some company scale battles in an increasingly ruined urban environment. The Bitter Enders is really about letting players go to town. Mout or Fibua scenarios in Shock Force usually put a lot of constraints on players by limiting how much off-map support they have available or punishing them for collateral damage. That generally makes life a bit difficult. People are constantly asking, how do I clear buildings? They worry about heavy casualties, and they're generally very reluctant to exercise what firepower they have available. It's partially an excuse in making things more balanced. Shock Force doesn't have symmetrical sides, so it's quite common for scenario designers to provide some challenge by limiting the assets available to blue. I wanted to go in the opposite direction and let everybody cut loose. Give players the option to use overwhelming firepower and engage with the slightly different challenge of applying it in an effective way. Hand in hand with that, our fictional city of Harabesh has no civilians. While American forces were bypassing the city during the invasion, the local commander rounded up all the non-combatants and kicked them out in an attempt to clog up the roads with refugees and slow the coalition down. Regardless of how smart a move that is, I don't think it's totally outside the realms of possibility, and it means that players can feel less guilty about taking the gloves off and deleting entire city blocks as and when they feel the need. That, of course, doesn't come without costs, and the level of destruction in a city is going to have tactical effects in later missions. Speaking of later missions, there is a Purple Force mission in there. We're used to the idea of a Blue Force and a Red Force. A Purple Force, logically, is a force that combines blue and red elements. In this campaign, there are some Syrian army deserters that the player has to rescue. In earlier versions of the campaign, there was going to be a mission where the player's force basically sat on some high ground and spent an hour or so using close air support and the drone artillery team to find and destroy enemy units in the city. Those would be core units for the red side that would carry on into later missions. So if players could locate and destroy, for example, a tank platoon, they wouldn't have to fight it later on. The idea was to highlight the preparatory or shaping phase of operations that usually happens off-screen in CM. The deserters were originally going to feature in the mission before that, where players would have to sneak them out of the city, avoiding checkpoints and patrols so that they could surrender to coalition forces. If the player succeeded, they would have more starting intelligence for the off-map support blows everything up mission. Ultimately, neither of the prototypes for those missions were actually that much fun to play. I love the concept, but the actual player experience for the shaping mission was mostly waiting for drones to spot things, and then waiting some more for off-map support to come in and blow it up. So it wasn't very interesting, and it got canned along with the deserters bumbling around in the dark. Though the deserters did manage to stay in the campaign for Mission 3. This campaign also actually had a named opponent at one stage. The big bad was a crazy Syrian army colonel holding the defenders together. I ended up deleting all references from the briefings because it was just an extra layer of complication that wasn't really needed and was probably just going to confuse the hell out of people. If I remember correctly though, he does still pop up and try and do a runner in the final mission, so keep an eye out, you might spot him. The city of Harabesh itself is fictional, but the terrain for the master map isn't. I was originally going to set the campaign in Deir ez-Zor, So I started making the district of Harabesh on the southeast side, before I realised that the Dutch campaign dealt with that area. Part of the Battle Pack concept was to keep it confined to the Villanelle base game, which is why it's just Americans and Syrians. So instead of just blanking out the Dutch presence, it made more sense to set the Bitter Enders a bit further south. The Hornet's Nest campaign, meanwhile, had less prototyping and iteration. I pretty much knew exactly what I wanted to do, and then I just went and did it. It was very much supposed to be a self-contained, mini-operation kind of campaign where the player's troops are basically fighting different parts of the same battle. You could feasibly amalgamate all 4 missions into one big scenario, but A, that didn't really fit the concept of the Battle Pack, and B, it would get super complicated. Splitting it up into chunks lets a scenario designer reset at intervals, as it were, and have to cater for significantly less developing wackiness. Again, the maps are all based on real places. Both are west of Meza Air Base in southwest Damascus. And we get our first proper purple force here. The Meza Air Base QRF makes an appearance, and that's a Syrian recon company with some attached US teams acting as advisors. It's really interesting having Strykers and BMP-2s working together, because they're quite different. The BMPs have more firepower, but the Strykers have thermals and arguably better armour because they got the cages on. I did toy with turning the last mission into one of the standalones because I quite like it, but adapting it for PvP play threw up a lot of issues and it really wasn't that interesting. Of course, if you want to play it PvP, you can always unpack the campaign and have a go at the scenario, though the blue infantry platoon that's the focus of the campaign will have its full ammo loadout, and that takes a lot of the tension out. I also really tried to make a standalone mission using the really dense urban terrain on that map that never really gets used. Ultimately, there were 2 that got to the prototype stage, one where the player controls a Special Forces platoon conducting a raid, and another where they control a striker platoon trying to clear out the whole block. Ultimately, both of these fell through because, well, firstly, they weren't particularly interesting or fun to play, basically being grindy urban mosh pits, and secondly because the density of the terrain really made the AI pathfinding a challenge. I got a lot better at making AI plans over the course of making the Battle Pack, but here it didn't seem worth the effort to make those scenarios work. So that's a bit about the 2 more conventional campaigns, meaning now we're going to talk about the others. The first of these was Probable Cause, the Special Forces campaign. Special Forces shenanigans are one of those things that occupies a weird space in public consciousness. As a rule, people want to see high-speed, low-drag, super cool kinetic action, which is usually a good indicator that your Special Forces operation is a disaster. That obviously depends a bit on exactly what you're up to, but things get worse when we try and plug that into combat mission. CM has a lot of variability and abstraction in areas where SOF are traditionally dominant, areas like individual skills, fireteam level drills, stealth and all that fun stuff. If we take a typical kinetic Special Forces task like storming a building, well, you'll know how much of a dice roll clearing buildings is in combat mission. You're going to be very lucky to not take casualties, and you can't really do much about that. And building missions where the player has the kind of firepower to fight with more reliable outcomes means that you're probably not dealing with a small-scale operation anymore. So part of the challenge for Probable Cause was providing an SOF experience that was realistic, plausible and interesting to play, without getting kinetic in ways that would result in prohibitively heavy casualties or leave player success down to a flip of the coin. All that said, the SOF element wasn't actually the starting point. The original concept was for players to control a purple force in light vehicles patrolling the highway. It was going to be very Mad Max, with Humvees and Technicals working together, but it very quickly started to compromise the Battle Pack concept. The number of units in the player's core force started to escalate very quickly. Thinking about something like a US infantry platoon as modelled in Shock Force, you can't fit a whole squad in a Humvee. If you split them, you have a 5-man team and a 4-man team. They'll fit in a Humvee each, so our 3-squad platoon actually breaks down into 6 teams in 6 vehicles. But that compromises a lot of flexibility. In CM, we can't split those fire teams down any further, so we end up with a team that can be in the Humvee or not in the Humvee. If it's in the Humvee, only the driver and the gunner are of any use, If they're out of the Humvee, they lose the speed, armor, and a heavy weapon. You can't really do this and work with the sensible Humvee supporting dismount setup that everyone is going to want and expect. We could use the mount organization for the infantry instead, which gives us a 4-3-3 split, but we've still got a 4 there, and we need to add 2 more 2-man teams from somewhere so that the 3-man teams can actually dismount and retain use of the vehicle. The result was a very weird, overcomplicated core force with loads of little bits and lots of vehicles, and that was before trying to incorporate the Syrians. So it just made sense to reduce the player force to a lightly armed special forces team. As much as I really wanted to bring along javelins and M240s and 60mm light mortars, the core force ultimately ended up as 6 2- to 3-man teams spread across 4 Humvees. That, of course, created its own big stack of follow-on design challenges, and ultimately there are some aspects of this campaign that are pushing at the boundaries of CM's mission maker limitations. Things like spotting-based missions can be a bit of a weak link, but it's a unique campaign. It's a change of pace. I think whether or not SOF-centric content really works in Combat Mission is pretty questionable, but it is something that this campaign is exploring. Speaking of things that are questionable, the final campaign is the Red campaign, Inglorious Footnote. I really wanted to do a Red campaign. Up until now there hasn't been an official one. The Syrian side is surprisingly popular, probably because they offer more of a challenge than Blue, so that was something I really wanted to tackle. But the core issue with a Red campaign is that if they go up against Blue in anything resembling a stand-up fight, it's not really plausible for them to do anything except get curb stomped. Blue has an overwhelming qualitative advantage, so for Red to succeed they either have to tackle an implausibly small and isolated Blue force, or mass an implausibly large force of their own. For instance, it's possible to make a scenario where the player gets a company of T-90s and Blue gets a scout platoon in Humvees, but the realistic endpoint there is the Humvees run away, and Coalition air power mulches the Syrians. That's the kind of scenario where you have to suspend a lot more disbelief than usual if it's going to work. So my original thought was to stay away from conventional warfare, stick with the uncons, and work out some kind of insurgent campaign. Step 1 is always research. If we look at places like Iraq and Afghanistan, how do insurgencies work? What do insurgent cells actually do down at the micro-tactical level? Well, the answer to that is basically horrifyingly unethical stuff beyond the scope of Combat Mission that starts with the intimidation, abuse, extortion and murder of non-combatants and goes downhill from there. So we're not doing that. I briefly toyed with the idea of the players controlling some kind of local defense militia in the chaotic disintegration of the Syrian regime, so you would have to fight bandits or marauding ex-regime forces or foreign fighters that have come into the country looking for a fight, but it never really came together. The Uncon ToE is not great, and it relies a lot on mass. It's made up of loads of small teams that very quickly start to compromise the battle pack's intent to keep forces manageable. Yes, if you have to take something like a US infantry platoon, you can break it down into a lot of small teams, but you don't have to. Or at least you don't have to until you close with the enemy. With the Uncons, you're inevitably forced to deal with huge numbers of Icons if you want a reasonably capable force. So that was a bit of a dead end. After that I started experimenting with IED strikes, so I ran with one micro campaign concept which involved scouting out an IED location, sneaking in to plant the device, then detonating it for the right target and making an escape. It very quickly became obvious that this was equal parts boring, unintuitive and difficult to make the AI plans for. To begin with, we basically have to create a non-combat environment in a game which is intended to approximate high-intensity conventional combined arms warfare. Getting the TAC AI to do basic non-combat stuff like walk around or drive along a road is a bit of a nightmare. Then when we factor in CM's incumbent randomness and variability, we have to deal with all kinds of problems for which there really aren't in-game solutions. To test all this out, I built a really simple scenario where a blue vehicle drives down the road towards an IED. Sometimes the target vehicle is going to get bogged and immobilized before it reaches the IED. Mission scrubbed, not the player's fault. Sometimes the IED just malfunctions. Mission scrubbed, not the player's fault. Sometimes the IED triggerman fails to spot the target vehicle. Mission scrubbed, nothing the player can do about it. Sometimes the target vehicle spots the IED triggerman and shoots them in the face. Mission scrubbed, nothing the player could do. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's loads of stuff like this that can happen, and it's all beyond the player's control. Worse, in this entire setup, the player isn't actually doing anything. They just activate the IED at the start and wait for the target vehicle to run into it. Even deployment is heavily restricted. The IED has to be on the route the target vehicle will take, and the triggerman has to be within range and line of sight of the IED, as well as having enough line of sight of the target vehicle's approach that they can reliably spot it and then maintain that spot all the way to the explosion. There's so much that can go wrong here, and one of the ways to minimize the amount of stuff that can go wrong is to limit the player's agency and reduce them to a spectator. So the IED-based campaign didn't make the cut. The work done on it did a lot of the heavy lifting for the IED tutorial, which was something else I really wanted to include, and even that can go sideways in a few ways. Ultimately, after messing with a few more concepts and coming away disappointed, I decided to change tack and, to some extent, make a red campaign that explains why there are no red campaigns. Just how did the Syrian armed forces end up reduced to fighting an insurgency when they were preparing for some kind of epic Gotterdammer run? And the campaign ended up being called Inglorious. Footnote, if that isn't a giveaway as to how it goes down, it got that name because I thought Reality Check was a little bit too on the nose. So, that is a quick once-over of the new Shock Force 2 Battle Pack. Hopefully I've shed some light on why the campaigns are the way they are, and a little bit of the process behind them. A big shout out to Mikey D again, as well as all the playtesters and Battlefront for the opportunity. There have been a couple of issues with the release. Fingers crossed by the time this video goes out the issues will have been fixed. I know that's been worked on furiously behind the scenes as I record this. To close out then, I really hope you guys enjoy the Aftermath Battle Pack. I'm not sure if I'm going to do any playthroughs here on the channel because I know exactly what's going on. It's not like there's any surprises or tension. I'd just be going through the motions, but we'll see. It's not off the table. Whether I do or not, thanks for watching. Obviously, I'm incredibly biased about this, so go and buy the Battle Pack if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video.